Well, I had a great speech prepared about living with indigenous people, the different tribes I've been living with, because over the last 3 years, I spent about a year living in the jungles in New Guinea and the Amazon and all sorts of other places. But something happened a couple of days ago which radically changed everything. I was being interviewed and someone was asking me what my inspiration was for my adventures, and I was trying to say that my inspiration was Indiana Jones. I'd watched too many Indiana Jones films as a kid, but instead of saying Indiana Jones, I stupidly said Grace Jones. Which I'm not going to tell you why that was. I'm not going to try and explain why Grace Jones was on my mind at that particular moment, but safe to say she was, and it was live television. So it's unfortunately one of those things which happen in one's life, and so I thought, well, I'm going to have to change my talk a little bit. So today I'm going to talk about making mistakes, cock-ups, because I think we all do. And for some reason, just by uttering Grace Jones, I seem to live into, I think, what Indiana Jones is all about, because Indiana Jones is all about just getting involved in all sorts of ridiculous cock-ups. And this is where my life really began, with this, not this particular brick, but a similar one. It's one of my earliest memories, one of my first mistakes. As a kid, I'd learned about gravity. I wasn't a particularly smart kid. I was particularly slow, if anything. But I wanted to test out what gravity was all about. So I found myself a brick. I climbed up a tree. And you know what happens next. I jumped out of the tree with a brick. I was 4 or 5. I was a young man, a confused boy, perhaps. But what happened after then, I then climbed up the stairs. I went back home with a huge gash in my head, bleeding profusely, to my mother and explained what had happened. And she said, well, first of all, let's get your head stitched up. So we did. Went down to the doctor and got my head stitched up. And then she said, okay, well, you've got to learn from your mistakes. And I thought, well, this is good. She said, well, where would Jack the Beanstalk have been if he hadn't thrown his beans out the window? Where would Cinderella have been if she hadn't lost her shoe? I thought, well, there's something to this. She said, but you got to remember one thing. Newton was the guy who kind of described and found out all about this gravity thing. He used an apple, not a brick. So as a young man, and as a young boy, I realized I wasn't going to be the smartest kid on the block. If I'd known about the EG conference, I realized I wasn't going to be an astronaut. I wouldn't have made it to be an inventor. But I thought, okay, I've got to come up with some other way to make a living. So I went into my books as a kid and came across this guy, Christopher Columbus, one of the great explorers. But he was also one of the greatest cock-up artists on the planet. He set off when everyone else was saying the world was flat. He thought, well, the world might be round. But he was trying to find a new path to Asia. Instead, he stumbled across the New World. And it was one of the greatest mistakes ever made in the history of exploration. And I thought, okay, maybe I can become an explorer. So I started looking into what exploration meant. And then these two sort of key things sort of jumped out at me. The first was from a guy called Pablo Picasso that we all knew. He went down to the Lascaux Caves in the Pyrenees. And he was there to study the oldest form of art anywhere in the world. And he came out of there rather confused, rather baffled, and said, there is nothing new under the sun. There is nothing new under the sun. And I thought, oh, this is a man who's been accredited with inventing some great new artistic form, but he's obviously having a bit of a wake-up call here. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to look at exploration and discovery. And then the second guy who had a great effect on me was Marcel Proust. And he said, the true voyage of discovery isn't seeking new lands, it's having fresh eyes. So this was the basis for my first expedition, which was in Mongolia. I was just out of school, and we were there to research one of the greatest communication highways in history that went from Genghis Khan's capital city, Karakoram, or Haohorin, in central Mongolia, to Yuan Shangdu, or Xanadu, in northern China, just north of Beijing. And it linked these two great capitals of Genghis Khan's empire to Kublai Khan's empire, this great communication highway. It was going to be a fantastic historical research expedition. It was endorsed by the Royal Geographical Society, the spiritual home of exploration for us Brits, the same place that the likes of Shackleton, Livingstone, Scott had come out of. But unfortunately, they didn't really reckon on me showing up, because it was, I think, one of the single worst planned expeditions ever mounted. I put together a great team of people. There's Yves Gaglioli in the middle, Anthony Parkinson, the photographer, and Edmund Brown on your right. And the first problem we had was on the recce of the expedition the year before. I had been there trying to scout out a good place. I'd been riding. and trying to show off some girls that were there, and unfortunately I was trying to stand on my saddle at full gallop, not a particularly sensible thing to do, but the piece of leather snapped and I careered off and broke my arm. So I wasn't particularly well versed at wanting to get back on a horse. None of the other guys could ride either. But that wasn't going to be a problem for us. We decided we would crack on all the same. And we entered into the steppe. But first of all, it was a good sort of 400 miles on horses. No one knew how to ride. We got held hostage by some thugs for a little bit. We had our horses stolen. We really weren't very good at what we were doing. But we did finally learn to ride, so that was a good thing. But the problem was what happened next. We got to the edge of the Gobi Desert. And the Gobi Desert is the least populated place outside the polar caps. Our horses took one look in and said, nah, we're not going in there. So we had to part exchange our horses for camels and a cart and end up looking forward to the walk, which is about a 1,500 kilometer walk across the Gobi Desert, which we weren't particularly planned for. Also, my team didn't have much of a... they were sort of running out of confidence in me at this point, especially because the last time I was in a desert was the Wadi Rum Desert in Jordan. It's not a particularly big desert, but I managed to get lost in there. And I was saved, fortunately, by a group called the Bedouin who were living there. And the Bedouin and the Wadi Rum Desert, I think, is really famous for this great guy, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And the Bedouin there couldn't pronounce his name, so instead of calling him Lawrence, they called him Orens, which I think is a name which really captures the romantic spirit of this great adventurer. They also had a problem pronouncing my name, Olly, so instead of calling me Olly, they called me Colin. And with all due respect to the great people who are called Colin on this planet, it's not really a name which conjures up sort of the romance of the adventure like Orens or Indiana Jones. So, yes, well, they didn't really have much confidence in me. And we set off on our walk. We ran out of food and water quite quickly. And I remember talking to Edmund, who was in charge of supplies, and I said, how are we looking at supplies? And he said, well, not too good today. And I was, well, why not? And he said, well, we have, for the next 4 days, we have 4 boiled sweets and some wet wipes to drink. I thought, this is not a good day at the office, especially because the temperatures were over 40, 45 degrees. But then things got even worse. It started to rain. We weren't really expecting it to rain in the Gobi Desert, but it did. Hypothermia started to set in. We were getting close down to the Mongolian-Chinese border. And it was at that point that we needed to get into some shelter because hypothermia was setting in and we thought we needed to get in there. And what happened, we found a little shelter. It was bigger than we expected. It wasn't on any map. It turned out to be a military installation belonging to the Mongolian military who welcomed us in. We tried to explain we were slightly confused students. We'd gone on holiday by mistake, but they didn't buy that. They thought we were spies, strangely, and so locked us up. And yeah, it wasn't a pleasant sort of, it wasn't the Mongolian Hilton or anything like that. But we did need to get out somehow, so we came up with this great plan of breaking out of jail. Anthony was suffering from giardia, which I won't go into the details, but it does involve quick evacuations, shall we say. And obviously we didn't have ensuite in our cell, so we had to bang on the door, and one of these evacuations, he banged on the door was open, the guards were standing there. He jumped on one of the guards, Ed jumped on another one, and I legged it out. I managed to smuggle in the satellite phone into the cell with me at that point. So I got out, ran out into the darkness, climbed up a hill to get a signal, turned on the phone, and it had one little cell left. And I was like, oh shit, this isn't good. So I quickly dialed into home base, which was the expedition headquarters, which was being run by my parents at the time, and called them up, and I said, got them on the phone. I said, oh, hi, Mum. I've just escaped from a jail in Mongolia. I'm on the run. They think we're spies. It's not looking good. But she wasn't listening. All she wanted to do was tell me about her holiday in Cornwall, in southwest England. It's a lovely place, but not the kind of story I wanted to hear at that moment. So she carried on talking. I was looking at the battery going, this is not going to end well. Then she passed the phone over to my father, and all he had heard was this great story about his holiday in Cornwall. So he carried on telling me about how they'd been surfing, the weather was glorious, and then the battery goes dead. I was like, oh, shit. And then I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm stuck in the middle of the Gobi. I haven't got food or water. My friends are in jail. I had to go back. So I went back into jail. Anyway, In the end, a few days later, with some quite senior diplomatic intervention, we did get released and we did carry on with the expedition. And it was a great success in the end. We all survived more or less intact. So why am I telling you the stories of my huge incompetence? Well, I think there is something to these great mistakes that we all make. Except, I mean, obviously there are some people here, we don't want to be making mistakes, Katie Coleman, and people who are involved in nuclear fission and things like that. Please don't listen to the rest of what I'm going to tell you. But I have been very fortunate enough to make a career out of something I am actually terrible at, which is traveling. Wherever I leave home, something always goes wrong. And fortunately for me, unfortunately for my current employers, Discovery, they've asked me to make this new series, Solving History. And here's a few clips of some of the ridiculously stupid things I've got involved in recently. Welcome to Europe's largest active volcano. Sulfur fumes that have just got in my lungs. I'm out of breath. I've got a machete, a climber's worst nightmare. Mixing machetes with ropes, never a good idea. Ow! Ah. Well, I think now I know why this city's been lost for so long. Where's Bear Grylls when you need him? That's what I want to know. He'd be perfect at this. He would know exactly what to do. He wouldn't get his machete stuck in the bamboo, would he? But I wish God had come up with an 11th commandment. Thou shalt not eat testicles. Delicious.
Wish I had Michael Phelps in that. Stop double first. Oh,
I don't know what I did wrong. Probably everything. Yes. That was just the tip of the iceberg. But if you're being kind, you probably think that I'm just naive, maybe. If you're unkind, you probably think I am hugely incompetent. But there are some, in trying to find some sort of solace in all these mistakes, I've started to look around in these last few days, try and find out what other great mistakes have been made. And I found a few. This one, obviously, cup of tea. Tea was made, well, it was discovered by mistake. The X-ray, again, another great mistake. The Earl of Sandwich. Apparently he was the inventor of the sandwich, but that was something he discovered by mistake. Guide dogs for the blind. I'm not sure how they found out about that, but they did. The Frisbee, although this guy probably wished that Frisbees hadn't been invented. Glass. The vulcanization of rubber, obviously. That's what that picture's all about. Coca-Cola. Whatever you think of it, it's a highly successful business, unfortunately, for some. And the implantable pacemaker. Again, I'm not sure how they discovered that by mistake, but they did, apparently. But there are three sort of key mistakes I really want to look at for these last few minutes. The first is to do with bitter moldy bread. Fleming, 1928, he left out a piece of bread by an open window, and he noticed that it started to go moldy, unsurprisingly. And when he was going to throw out his piece of moldy bread, and he decided, well, I better have a look at it under the microscope. And when he did, he realized that the spores were eating some harmful bacteria. It was the basis of penicillin. Quite a handy one. The light bulb. Thomas Edison obviously invented that. And he made, I think, 10,000 mistakes before he got to inventing the correct light bulb, which I took sort of great comfort in, that there was, one of the greatest inventors of all time. And he said he didn't make, he said he found 10,000 reasons that didn't work. That's a good mental attitude. That's the way we should be looking at dealing with our mistakes. But he also said, our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. And that is a mantra I take with me. And without that, I would have died, I don't know how many times, certainly in the Gobi when we ran out of food and water there, in gun markets in Yemen when I was trying to film. Some gun markets there. All sorts of sort of strange things which happen. If you, as soon as you stop, you fail. And if you're working on the sort of the frontiers, that can mean death, unfortunately. And there is obviously this. Anyone know what this is? The greatest mistake ever made. Come on, we're a tough crowd. This is his greatest mistake. He was a master of making mistakes. He made all sorts of mistakes. He made some huge goofs. He went out of his way to cock up equations as well. He failed to provide some proof for his equation E equals mc squared. It took, I think, 7 or 8 times before he finally came up with that one. But he also was a very wise man, and he knew of a good excuse for making mistakes. This was his excuse for making mistakes. Anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. And he's absolutely right. We have all made mistakes. Grace Jones still haunts me to this day. But what James Joyce said, and sorry for referring to other people who are far wiser than me, he said that mistakes are the portals for discovery. Mistakes are the portals for discovery. And I think they are. I think discovery is the basis of all exploration. It's the discovery of new knowledge. But the frontiers have changed, obviously, when we come to talking about exploration today. We know, more or less we have charted the surface of the world, but we still know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of the oceans. We're hitting a time maybe where we're going from exploration, where as far as we can go that way to outer space, we can go that way into inner space. We're going from exploration to imploration. We are all explorers because we all have something new to learn. And it all starts with that simple question that we want to see beyond the closed door. And I'm hugely passionate about exploration because I think that we all have a duty to explore the world. Certainly the audience sitting here today. We have a duty to progress the understanding of our planet. Exploration has always been the basis of our progression. But I wonder how much of our progression has been lost because of people's failure to want to make mistakes and people who are scared of making those mistakes. So I'm just going to show you one final clip of some more mistakes, which will hopefully make you all feel a little bit better about yourself. Let's see.
I knew this was going to be bad, but I didn't realise it would be like that.
San Pedro could be like vodka. Because, yeah, the first 3, 4, 5, not too bad, but it's just the one that tips you over the edge. Slight confusion as to the location where the temple would have been.
That's one of the great hazards of cutting bamboo. I look forward to trying to explain it to the listeners when I get home. She'll be like, what did you do? Why did you do that? Yes, well, so please, just in the last minute I've got, please afford me one very simple pleasure, unless you're Katie Coleman or a nuclear physicist. Please do go out in the world and go and make mistakes. And whatever those mistakes are, just enjoy them and thrive on what they are. And take a good lawyer with you when you do make those mistakes. Thank you very much.